Walter Cronkite and I met at the University of Texas. When I first arrived as a freshman, I found that I was constantly being called on by the professors, not because they wanted any information from me, they just wanted to hear a Brooklyn accent. And I think the same thing happened to Walter, who came from Kansas City.
I pretty well worked my way through college. Seems to me I always had 2 or 3 jobs going at the same time. I corresponded for the Houston Post, campus correspondent. I worked on the Daily Texan, the school community newspaper. It was the newspaper work for me. I just fell in love with the darn business. The city room of a newspaper was about the most exciting place in the world. It was noisy, typewriters going, teletype machines going, and when the presses rolled, the whole building shook. I loved it. I was briefly a picture snatcher for the Houston Press. I was ordered to get a picture of a young lady who'd been killed in an auto crash that had some scandalous overtones, married man involved or something of the kind. And I was sent out to the rather modest home of this woman, but there was nobody home. And this was the day when nobody locked their doors. There was a screen door, and I could see through the screen door a picture of a young lady there on the piano. And I figured, well, that's obviously our object of the search. So I just helped myself. I went in, got the picture, intending to return it, naturally. But I got it to the Houston Press, and we printed it. The only problem was that there was a wrong woman. The paper had sent me to the wrong address. That saved my skin.
A news flash, it's LaGuardia by a landslide.
Hello, everyone. Bo Carter speaking.
I got my first broadcasting job while I was at the University of Texas in Austin. It was a station called KNOW.
The kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby.
I talked my way into a job doing sports reports, mostly baseball scores in the late afternoon.
Your last-minute headline news.
There were a couple of wonderful moments when the station ran out of commercial announcers and shoved me into the spot as a very willing substitute. And one of these occasions was when a man who would later become governor of Texas, W. Leo Daniel, brought his cowboy band to Austin.
That $1 Million Smile is the latest thing in style.
You got all this cacophonous cowboy western music, and I stood there and said, W. Leo Daniel and his light crust doughboys are on the air. Woohoo! Greatest moment of radio.
And I got that $1 Million Smile.
At one point, there was an opening for a staff announcer at KNOW. I applied for the job, but the manager of the station said he was afraid I'd never make a radio announcer. I got so involved in the newspaper business, which I loved, and a little bit of radio on the side, that actually I wasn't going to class as much as I should have. I'm afraid I dropped out of college, much to my regret, ever since. In 1936, I moved back to Kansas City to take a job doing news and sports on a small radio station called KCMO. And one of the most exciting parts of that job was we did reconstructed football games. I'd be in the studio receiving sketchy little telegraph reports from the stadium, which I'd then flesh out. They'd say something on the telegraph like, Brown to L.T. Jones. And it would go something like, it's Notre Dame's ball on their own 35, and they're back in the huddle. They're breaking out of the huddle. They're going over toward the left side of the line. It looks like Brown's carrying the ball. He's right in the middle of that pileup. He couldn't have made much on that one. Well, it looks like about 2 yards, and the tackle was made by Eddie Jones. Jones again on that. That boy's playing some football game today. So it's Notre Dame's ball, 2nd and 5 on their own 32-yard line. There came the day at KCMO when down the corridor, and I could see her coming, the most gorgeous creature I'd ever seen in my life, an absolutely sensational redhead. Her name was Betsy Maxwell. I was, for some strange reason, rather shy about meeting her. Several days went by when I was wondering how I was going to accomplish that very important task, when the two of us were suddenly cast in a commercial.
They handed us each a script, and he read his part and I read my part.
And I say, "Well, hello, Angel, what heaven did you drop from?"
And then the girl says, "I'm not an angel, I was just a stranger in town."
"Boy, you look like an angel." "Girl, that's because I use Richard Hudnut Cosmetics."
It seems kind of strange now, but they don't write them much better on television, I find, either.
At any rate, that introduced us, and we went together for several years and finally married in 1940. Kansas City was a great town to be young in. It was wide open, fairly illegal town with a lot of open gambling, a lot of open bars and things open all night, and it was a great mecca for jazz. The great Count Basie came to fame there. There were some pretty wild scenes. There were a couple of joints that served lunch with nude waitresses. And that was one of the few places I've ever seen in the world that had nude waitresses at lunch.
Here, day on day of merciless, unrelieved heat had taken a bitter toll.
Those years in Kansas City included the years of the Dust Bowl. We were part of that terrible natural disaster. We could look from the 15th floor office space occupied at station KCMO right out across the plains of Kansas. And we watched every day these terrible dust clouds forming out there. And sometimes they swept into Kansas City itself. When they did, it was choking. You'd find if you blew your nose, you were blowing a little mud along with it. If you had a tear, you had a roll of little mud down your cheek. A lot of the farmers who had to leave their land came into Kansas City in their first stop. Many of them joined that great westward movement that was depicted by John Steinbeck so famously, with the Okies moving out to California.
Get me London, United Press Bureau. Make it snappy.
After a year or so there at KCMO, I went back to my first love, newspaper.
Here's a flash, Joe.
I got a job at the United Press Wire Service.
Get Washington on the phone. Find out who's
I
aboard
don't
the
think
Panay and
there's
give him the
anything
list
like
right away.
press service work. You've got a deadline literally every minute with a couple of thousand clients around the world. You've got to be accurate. You've got to be fast. It's just one of the most exciting businesses that can be.
Flash.
My first really big story was in 1937. I covered the explosion of the school in New London, Texas.
In the ghastly ruins of a Texas school is written the most appalling disaster of its kind in American history.
I was the first press service man on the scene, and here under the glare of these oil field lights, the oil field workers themselves, whose own children were in there, tears streaming down their faces, their hands bloodied from tearing at this masonry, getting at these kids.
Only 5 minutes remained before dismissal time when the explosion came, which in a moment wrought such havoc as to shock the entire nation. Gas was probably the cause.
I had learned even before that event that you've got to get the story as quickly as possible. Everybody, with each retelling of any experience, alters it just a little bit. So you've got to get to it as quickly as you can. It was really a ghastly scene and, of course, a major news story for days. In a clearly desperate effort to find feature material when I was with United Press in Kansas City, I took to going to the burlesque house, strictly professional, you understand. But I met some fascinating characters there, naturally. One of them was a stripper named Hinda Wasu. I remember on one occasion I was asking Hinda, we weren't quite in the war yet, I said, "Miss Wasu, what do you think burlesque part will be in maintaining wartime morale?" And she grabbed my coat lapel like Lyndon Johnson did in later years, pulled us together and said, "Let me tell you something, sonny boy. The morals behind a burlesque stage are just as good as the morals at Radio City."
Still to come, Cronkite Remembers World War II.
I'm just back from the biggest assignment that any American reporter could have so far in this war.
And later, the dawn of television.
We literally figured out how to do it as we went along.
Let's go to Capitoline Hill.
I was thinking how fortunate our great heroes